Hello and welcome back to Norwich Talk for podcast number 68. I'm joined by Mr. Connor Southwell. Connor, it's a while since we appeared on camera together. How are you, my friend?
Good. Yeah, good. It's an interesting time, isn't it? I think that's probably the best. How are you, more importantly, Benjamin? How are you?
Yep, I'm all right. I'm kind of relaxed. I don't know if you are because I'm a fan. I get to just say what I want and there are absolutely no repercussions for what I'm going to say. But the podcast today, not going to be a pleasant one. Dean Smith's sort of just done his press conference, which gives us a bit more to talk about. We're going to try and keep it under an hour. Where to start, Connor, man? I really don't know where to start. I say that, but I do. Anthony Richards, Norwich's finance director, was interviewed on the club YouTube channel. An interview that, in short, I think, we kind of agreed, didn't we? Was okay until it got to the back end where he gave his own opinion, essentially. And it kind of raises the question, well, why is the finance director talking to us about these certain things? But in terms of having that balance scale, positives from the interview, Connor, what would you say they were?
Well, like you say, I thought the first 13 minutes of that video was really insightful, really interesting, even if particularly the answers weren't necessarily what people would want to hear, particularly around, say, the January window, for instance, and around the loans, which I still have massive concerns about. The fact they've taken out over £60 million in loans. They've effectively removed their parachute payments for the next 2 years. They don't exist because of the money they've taken out. It would have been nice to see him go in a bit more depth around that, but at least there was some I don't know if transparency is the right word, but at least there was some answers on camera about what he wanted or why they did that, and the club's thought process behind it, because there's not been enough of that. The stuff around kind of the season tickets was interesting, safe standing, the feasibility of expanding the city stand, all stuff that ultimately, when you got to the end of the clip, was probably irrelevant, right? Because of the message that they got out. And I do feel for him a little bit, because he's been asked to answer questions that aren't really on his brief. And I think all of us in any profession know that if suddenly, say I was asked to answer questions on space or something along those lines, I wouldn't necessarily know how to answer those in the best way, or what the right answer would necessarily be. So, knowing how these things work, I would imagine he'd probably got a brief overview of what to say. And obviously that message that he's been asked to deliver hasn't been delivered necessarily in the right way, or the way that supporters would like. So I would imagine they probably feel quite frustrated with the reaction that it's got. I must be honest, I'm not quite sure why you would put one of your exec committee in that position answering questions that aren't really addressed to them. But the video itself, I thought, and actually it goes along with all of the insight videos, really. They have offered a degree of interest and answered questions, which is good. It's good that senior people in the football club are answering questions, albeit on in-house channels.
Yeah, I think one of the sort of points I made in my last video on this channel, where I basically just had a 20-minute spell of almost crying, was the idea of there's a lack of accountability at the football club. And I think this is an attempt to address it, but I think it's made it worse, in the sense of, as you said, you've got someone on the exec committee who is transparently talking about the concurrent issues at Norwich City. In theory, right, cool, that's okay. But you look at what happened, you break it down a little bit further, and what you see is a man who, in the interview, he says, look, I don't just do finances for on the pitch. I do finance for all around the club. So why is that the person, as you said, who is representing the football club, talking about on the pitch matters and the connection with the fans? I really think that, and I'm kind of torn as to whether I should be frustrated at him personally, or whoever's idea the interview was, in terms of, it seems a bit like he's been thrown under the bus, but also at the same time, he's a big boy who could say no. And I think it sort of dampens the idea of that Norwich are being accountable for actions. I kind of let out a bit of I wouldn't call it a laugh, but as soon as he said, I don't really believe in the disconnect between the fans and the club, I was a bit like, oh, for goodness sake, you really could have just left that alone. And to be honest, you would get comments, wouldn't you, from fans saying, talk about this, talk about that. But also I do genuinely believe that we would understand why Norwich's finance director isn't addressing the disconnect between the fans and the club, because it's got nothing to do with his role, and no one has ever mentioned him before, especially him specifically in terms of these issues. It's always been Stuart Weber, Dean Smith, well, those two really. What else from that interview? Are we happy to maybe move on from that, because it's difficult to not just sit here and repeat ourselves when it comes to this interview. It went down an absolute bomb, and I think there is, for what is the first time, unity amongst the Norwich fans in terms of that couldn't have gone much worse towards the end.
Yeah, I think that's been the reaction I've seen, to be honest. And like I say, that it is a shame, because there was lots of good stuff in that opening 13 minutes as well that's got lost. And this maybe kind of is where the club is at generally. There's a lot of stuff going on, good stuff going on behind the scenes that's kind of getting missed because of circumstances and whatnot. And it's worth saying, in my role, obviously we made a request to speak to Anthony Rickens ourselves around the finances and trying to get some accountability in terms of those. That request was declined because obviously they've, as they explained at the end of the video, they've opted to move to their in-house channels, which they're totally entitled to do. But yeah, I think it probably was. I think it was probably a difficult message for anybody to try and convey, let alone somebody whose maybe brief is elsewhere. And I think that's why I feel, or I have sympathy with Anthony. Because he's been kind of, I don't know, thrown into the deep end maybe and asked to answer a question that is outside of his remit. As I said, to repeat myself, if I was asked something on, I don't know, fashion or space or whatever, it's not something that I'm knowledgeable about, or
especially,
precisely. And it's not a brief that I'm over. Ultimately, that would be down to someone else's brief, So you would expect those people to be answering the relevant questions for the bits that they're responsible for. And I think in the end, you just kind of got this clumsy sort of statement towards the end, where I'm sure it wasn't intended as the way that fans have received it, but the fans have taken it in the way that they've taken it. And ahead of obviously a weekend that feels quite important, as I'm sure we'll get into, it just doesn't feel like it was a particularly helpful in terms of timing or in terms of delivery. And I'm sure when they reflect on that piece of content, as I'm sure they will reach the same conclusions.
Yeah, let's talk about that man then, and the figure who I think a lot of others think should have been the person doing the interview, talking about the last few questions, not the interview on finances, of course. Stuart Weber, Norwich's sporting director. I think where we're at with Stuart Weber right now is, I personally, if he goes, I'm kind of neutral, to be honest. You wrote a really good piece for the Pinkin that was, had a bit of a positive spin on it. And I looked at that and thought, yeah, I agree with this. But the experiences that we've had recently, which I'm going to outline and we're going to talk about, suggest to me that, yeah, maybe it is time for a refresh. We talk about a new project. Russell Martin is another name I'll throw in, which we'll talk about later. But this idea of a new project doesn't just come in the shape of a new head coach for me. It comes in the shape of looking at the very top and thinking, right, how do we change things to make it better? Where we're at with Weber, though, and please stop me if you disagree, over the past, 12, 16, 18 months, it's kind of got to a position where Stuart Weber has gone from untouchable, open, honest man doing a really good job creating this new 5-year project, to disinterested, climbing mountains during the season, no longer being open and honest in terms of on club channels, in interviews, and arguing with fans outside of Carrow Road. That kind of indicates to me that this journey, especially with him at the club, has gone. There were the links to Chelsea, which I'd like to sort of go through a little bit when I ask you my question. But where are you at with Stuart Weber in terms of how you think his role at Norwich City might have changed, how you think his interest in the project might have changed? Where on earth do we go from here with Mr. Weber?
Yeah, so I mean, the column you alluded to actually was me kind of arguing that, and I still believe this, if for whatever reason, Stuart Weber was to depart Norwich City tomorrow, I think it would be very difficult to have a look in the round at the job he's done at the club and come to anything but a positive conclusion. Now, like with anything, there's caveats within that, and there are periods within that are poor, and there are decisions within that are poor. And, I think you could argue, not necessarily that I would, but I think there is an argument to say, particularly because people tend to look at the recruitment, that if you look at the recruitment last summer, whoever you put in that position with however much money you put in that position would have had to take gambles of some description. Now, obviously, the flip side of that is, you take such gambles, you should expect at least one or two to come off. The fact they didn't, I guess, probably has drawn more criticism, and the way that season naturally unfolded. And plus, I think the fact that they removed a head coach and replaced him with a different one probably saw the spotlight shift towards him. And if you look at sporting directors all around the country, there aren't actually that many who do open themselves up and do lots of media and speak about approaches and plans. And I think you kind of hear and you feel stuff from Norwich at the minute, and it feels like just gradually they're trying to move into a different direction. And I think the approach has gone from we do not conform to almost, well, this is what other clubs do. Do you see what I mean? So I think there's been a slight shift in the outlook of what everything's about. Now, I'm not there day to day, so I don't know whether that's on Stuart Weber, or if that's on Zoe Ward, or if that's on the people driving the strategy behind the club. But there's definitively been a shift. You can see it, and as I spoke about with the approach to the local media and also the fan base and how they communicate. And so, I mean, to bring this all round to Stuart Weber, I think naturally football works in cycles, and I think you can see clubs and projects get very tired quite quickly and run out of steam pretty quickly whenever there is a dent or there's a bit of adversity. For me, this extends beyond Stuart Weber, there's a real absence of any sort of narrative this season. Like 18-19, Norwich were the underdogs. Every win felt so important. There was a fairy tale nature to it, an unexpectedness to it. Everyone was kind of caught up in this dizzying euphoria behind what Daniel Farke and his squad were producing. Then obviously the Premier League campaign happened, and Premier League campaigns, I always think you have a sense of trying to achieve something that's very difficult to achieve naturally. So that will, if you win a game, I think bring people with you. There's kind of a natural narrative for Norwich City in the Premier League because they're a small fish in a very, very big pond, ever increasing pond. The year kind of when they came back down to the Championship, it was almost a revenge mission. It was right, we're going to prove everyone wrong. We're going to prove that actually our project is right. And it was almost about reinforcement. And they did it again. They played a really attractive style of play with some really talented players and did it their way. Then I think all semblance of what had gone before kind of died in the dressing room when Norwich parted company with Daniel Farke. That was someone that Stuart Weber was very wedded to. It was a clear wedge between kind of the project that they'd embarked upon and perhaps where they wanted to go in the future. It was perhaps a realization that what they wanted to do was based more in fantasy rather than reality. And I've made this argument before. They've appointed a head coach who stylistically is very different. You've got Daniel Farke, who's probably an ideologist. This is how I want to play football. I'm going to impose how I want to play football on this team. And you're going to be able to come to Carrow Road and watch a team that you can easily identify and connect with. Dean Smith isn't that. He's more willing to adapt. He's more willing to, if a team presses, chip the ball in behind because that's where the space is. I think he's probably what I would describe as a problem-solving coach rather than a pragmatist. And almost I think what you need is an ideologist at this level, at Championship level, to win. But when the expectation is that winning becomes a norm, the focus becomes on the processes. So if you don't get the processes right, actually winning can feel quite stale, as it has done earlier on in this season. So you almost need to win, but win in a certain way and win with a certain look and feel to it. And that's what Daniel Farke was very, very capable at producing at this level. And then for the next bit, you almost need the problem solver, someone who's going to adapt game to game, someone who's going to be able to nullify opponents and keep games really tight and actually play on lower margins. Because when you do that in a league that you're expected to dominate in and be really successful in, actually the narrative shifts and it becomes a lot harder for people to buy into that. So I think when you kind of come through that process and you emerge at the end of that conversation, you end up with Stuart Weber, someone whose outlook on football has changed. I think that's undeniable because Norwich have shifted in a different direction. Maybe if even the principles are the same, the outlook is different. And I think you've got someone who probably, and this isn't a criticism. I think it's quite often perceived as a criticism, but if you stay in any job for so long and you put so much into it, so much intensity, and let's be honest, he's dragged this club into the 21st century. if you do that, you're going to have a degree of fatigue and a degree of tiredness and a degree of kind of burnout, I suppose. And I'm not suggesting he's there, because only he could really answer that. But I think that's maybe the perception that's around it, rightly or wrongly, at this moment in time. And it's difficult to know how you shift that. And I think it's easy, again, to point at maybe his extracurricular activities and say, oh, well, he's climbing mountains, so he's disinterested. Again, I don't think that's really based in reality. People don't go, oh, Dean Smith's off playing golf on a Sunday, that shows he's disinterested. I just don't think it's right. It's just one's more high profile than the other. So, yeah, I mean, I've probably stood up for him a little bit more than people would expect. But I think what you've got is maybe a Norwich project that, you know, and I've used this analogy in our recent podcast. It feels like the club's a bit of a conflicted teenager at the moment, doesn't really know what it is or where it's trying to go. And what they were really good at doing before was saying, right, this is the end goal, and these are the various steps that we're going to do to achieve that. And this time, I think they've just gone, right, there's the end goal, and that's it, and kind of left the rest of it open to interpretation, which hasn't really helped Dean Smith and probably hasn't helped buy in with the project, because if you're going to invest money or time into something as a fan, you need to believe in it. And I don't really feel at the moment that they're given much to believe in, and that's maybe the issue. I don't know if I've really answered your question, but there's a bit of a ramble there about kind of Stuart Weber and where I feel the club is at, kind of projecting outwards.
No, you definitely have. I think what I kind of gathered from that, and I think I definitely agree. There's no I think, I definitely agree, is Stuart Weber's sort of Norwich City bonfire has turned into just a little candle, is what it seems like anyway. From the outside, again, yeah, let's be balanced. Why not? We don't know what goes on day to day at the club. We don't know what goes on inside that man's head. But from the outside, and I'll be brave with it, it seems like, yeah, it is now just a tame little candle burning. And I don't know how we get back into bonfire territory. I don't know how.
But sorry to interrupt, but I think there's also, naturally, I think whenever you go through a cycle, and we see it in politics quite a lot, but if you have someone for too, or in any institution really, if you have someone at the top of it for too long, and football, you have to remember, works in kind of quicker, smaller cycles than most things. Eras are a lot quicker now than they used to be. But if you have anyone at the top of any institution for so long, be it Sir Alex Ferguson, who was at the top of Manchester United for 26 years, I don't think we'll ever see that again, to be honest, in modern football management. Or you have someone at the top of a business, there is, after so long, only so much that you can extract out of it. There's only so much messaging that you can do before they stop becoming new and they stop becoming fresh and exciting and dynamic. And the words that you've used before maybe don't have the same impact, or the ideas that you're having don't have the same impact. And again, it's difficult to suggest we're there without being embedded in that culture every day. But that is where it kind of feels like it is. And you can't say that with definitiveness, but you can kind of say the feeling and the perception and maybe what supporters perceive it to be. And that's why I use the word fatigue, because it kind of feels like, I don't want to say an end of a cycle, because again, that feels very definitive, but it does feel like it needs someone to just grab it and give it a little bit of a shake, and someone to just inject some fresh ideas at it. And I'm not really sure whether that's solely at Stuart Weber's level, whether that's Dean Smith's level, whether that's ownership level. And obviously we've seen the stuff around Mark Attanasio, but that's where it kind of feels like it just needs someone somewhere, internally or externally, to just give the whole thing a shake and a lift. And I'm not really sure how, if you're the same person trying to deliver the same messages, whether you can do that with the same effectiveness as someone who's coming in with a fresh voice and a fresh outlook. And again, that's not really a criticism of Stuart Weber. That's more just natural life cycles in football and of football clubs and of eras, because I think we see it all the time. You see trends kind of pop up and they disappear as quick as they pop up. And from feeling that Norwich City were very innovative a few years ago, it now feels maybe that other teams have come sort of past them a little bit. And that's quite interesting. And the dynamic of that is quite interesting. But that's kind of my perception of it. And again, to caveat, so I don't know, it's not taken the wrong way by anyone, but I'm not saying that that's anyone's fault. It's just nature. It's just the lifespan of a football club. Everyone sees it in the same way that Alex Neil's era at Norwich City had a lifespan and it came to an end, in the same way that Paul Lambert's era, which was very, very successful for the football club, had a lifespan and come to an end. You see it all the time at football. And to me, it just feels like, and again, whether the answer is internal or external, just needs a bit of a lift from somewhere, from someone.
Yeah, there's a couple of points in there I'd like to acknowledge before we move on to Dean Smith and we get into the more interesting thing, which is talking about football. That's what we love to do, albeit that's also depressing at the moment. The thing you said about sort of eras now being much shorter than what they once were, I think that's a really poignant point. And I can't say I really thought about that before. Like, you notice it in terms of, as you said, Alex Ferguson is a wonderful example in terms of 26 years, bottom to top. Yeah, it won't happen again. I think what was Daniel Farker at Norwich for 4, 5, or it was 4 years, wasn't it? And we look at that as an era, as a massive era, a massive part of this football club that we love. And that's only 4 years. So times really are changing. And the next question which you raise, which I don't think we can answer really until we hear from Stuart Weber, is who is that person to shake things up? Because you're absolutely right. It can be Stuart Weber. We've seen what a fantastic job he can do. It's just more so recency bias indicates that perhaps the personality gets in the way of being that person.
Yeah, that and I think like everyone, you get shaped by your successes, but probably more so by your failures. And if you try something and it doesn't work, your natural inclination is to not do it again. So there's probably a natural cycle of change within an individual. So is Stuart Weber the same person on October the 28th, 2022, as he was the first day he walked into Norwich City? Absolutely not, because experience dictates that that's not the case, and you learn and you try and develop and grow. And not all of those lessons at whatever point are positive. Some of them shape you negatively, and that's the same for people and in life. And he's still a relatively young man. He's not even 40 yet, and that in football is incredibly young to have worked as many years in the game as he has. So, experience dictates that he's not going to be the same person. It's just how radically has that outlook shifted, and what has it shifted to? And like you say, the fact that we don't really have an answer on that makes it very difficult to speak about, I think, because if he kind of presented that, I think it would be a lot easier for people to maybe understand exactly what the direction of travel is and was and is trying to be, as is what they were so good at the start, where, as I said, it was, we want to get here and these are the various blocks that we're going to need to do in order to get there. And the fact that people accepted that first year under Daniel Farker was mainly because they communicated it so well and they spoke about where they were trying to get to. And for the same reason, it's probably why people have put a lot more pressure on Dean Smith than perhaps he would have expected, or maybe some externally, again, not my view, I'm just presenting an alternative point of view. Some people externally maybe feel that he hasn't or doesn't deserve it at this moment in time. So, outlooks in people naturally shift, and it's the same for Daniel Farker. Wasn't the same coach at the end as he was at the start. I think we kind of all saw that with that game against Leeds last season. So it's then about how far someone tips and how far they shift and how their experience have shaped them and in what way they've shaped them. And that's probably the answer for Stuart Weber that we don't have, and probably the only person that does have the answer is the man himself, as you quite rightly say.
Yeah, it kind of feels like we've gone full circle in terms of, at the beginning of this project, it was right, let's get everything stable, then push for promotion, then establish ourselves in the Premier League. Because if before Stuart Weber came in, it was the whole look at this financial abyss that we're in. It almost feels a bit like we're heading towards that way again, because if we don't get promoted, as is it Richens or Rickens?
I don't know. There's some debate around it. I have to go back and listen to what he said. I think he said Richens, didn't he?
Okay. I haven't got a clue. But what he said essentially was, if we don't get promoted, it's all about player trading, and then the question then becomes about, well, who on earth are Norwich going to sell? Who is going to pay the 25 million that Everton paid for Ben Godfrey? Who is going to pay the 40 million that Aston Villa paid for Emi Buendia? Who's going to pay the 13 million for Jamal Lewis, which at the time a fantastic deal. So those kind of questions are more sort of longer term ones. We won't really touch on them today because I want to talk about football. But before we do that, let's get on to Dean Smith as a subject. We'll talk about him. My notes next to me say, what have I got? Four things I want to talk about. So his press conference manner, based off today, essentially, playing style, the direction of things. A season that I think you referenced, the 16-17 season, and things feeling like that, and maybe looking a little bit at his coaching of players before we get into maybe previewing tomorrow's game, and just maybe having a little bit of a tactical discussion, because I mean, even if it's depressing, that's still fun for the both of us. Let's talk about the press conference manner. You're a guy, obviously, who, as far as I'm aware, goes to every press conference, and you'll always see how he is. You'll get a better read of him than me, because the way I see it is I'll sometimes watch the videos. Mostly I'm looking at the Pinkin and Norwich City's tweets covering them. But you see him in person, you can get a better read of his character. He said something today, which before we started the video, you said there was a bit of fight, there was a bit of bite to what he was saying, which was quite refreshing, which I think's really interesting. The big comment that I wanted to talk about, maybe after you, if you can, generalize his press conference manner, because it says a lot about a manager, doesn't it? It says a lot about a person as well. The big comment was about asking Daniel Farke, and this was for Dean Smith to sort of prove his credibility, which he seems keen to do at the moment. It was asked Daniel Farke if Villa and Brentford were difficult to play against, and that seems to have, myself included, big time, riled quite a lot of Norwich City fans. Talk to me about his press conference manner and that comment, and what you make of that side of things. I think that's more sort of personality based, which I'm quite interested to get your thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, I went there today kind of knowing that, and it's very difficult actually when you kind of drive into the training ground, kind of knowing that you're going to have to ask some difficult questions, and they're, you know, I think any person who asks those questions who enjoys it is lying, to be honest, because obviously everyone wants to be, you know, for me, I'd much rather be asking about a certain tactical setup or why a certain player is doing a certain thing, but you know, that's not always possible. It's certainly not the narrative at the moment. So, you know, I kind of went knowing that I was going to have to ask him about being under pressure and about his record and what he was trying to do at the club and fans' frustrations. And I think with him, kind of what I've seen in pretty much a year now of him being in charge is he's always quite measured. I think some fans will tell you a bit too measured. I think he would say that it's probably good that he has an objective standpoint as a head coach, kind of keeps him level-headed. But he's quite consistent, really. Whether Norwich City have gone on a run like they have recently, or whether like they had earlier on in the season, they won a lot of games and found themselves at the top of the league. You tend to find him really, whenever he comes in and sits down, in a very similar manner, always very friendly, always very polite, always very personable, I think, but clearly someone who is always very considered in his message and what he says. And I think it was quite a shift when he first arrived, because, you know, you come out of a Daniel Farke press conference, you'd be in there for an hour, and it was almost like you were getting a lecture on football at points, but they're always really interesting. But if you came out of an hour, a long one, you'd feel like that was quite a short one. For Dean Smith, you can come out of a 20-minute one, and actually his answers to questions are a lot shorter. But I think the natural thing to say is, I think people jump to the assumption that he's blunt, and I don't think he is blunt. I think he just answers the question very directly and in a very straight manner, and some people are like that, or they waffle like me, like I'm doing now. So I probably expected him, when I put these questions to him, to be quite non-offensive, quite measured, quite balanced about it. And the fact that he obviously felt, again, as someone who's very considered about what he says in public to us and to the media, to convey a message or to get a particular message out there, that he wanted to kind of come out on the front foot and be much more willing to engage with those questions and offer actually probably a bit more of a robust defense of himself, of his plan, of the direction of travel that he sees the club going in, was very interesting. And to me, and again, you know, we have to caveat that the only person who knows exactly what he was trying to do with those messaging is Dean Smith. You can't get inside his head. But to me, it felt like he was projecting outwards, but also trying to project upwards as well. And, you know, it's natural. I think we see it whenever a manager's under pressure. Here's what I've done in my career. Here's my track record. Here's what I've proven I can do. You know, there's no reason why I can't achieve that again. And he's right. He did improve Walsall dramatically. He did improve Brentford dramatically. He did improve Aston Villa dramatically for a period of time. And all of those kind of improvements led to him getting bigger jobs, obviously culminating with Aston Villa. But you also have to acknowledge that those aren't really relevant to where he finds himself right now in this Norwich City setup with this group of players in this situation. And you know, I kind of asked him about the fact or whether experience in this kind of situation is helpful, because he's been through runs in his career where he was on the brink of getting the sack at Aston Villa before lockdown came in, and he obviously eventually went to keep them up. He had a spell at Brentford, and obviously his start at Walsall wasn't that particularly great because of the predicament they were in. So he's been in these bad runs before, and you know, he kind of didn't necessarily feel that was the case. They're never easy to manage. So I think naturally, whenever you are, as a human being, being asked to absorb pressure and criticism and having questions asked of your credibility and of your ability and of your reasoning behind decisions, I think it's quite natural to want to come out and defend yourself a little bit. And so that's why, in terms of tone and in terms of approach, I really admire what he did today. That's not to say that I think that the contents of his messaging were correct, because again, I don't necessarily think they all were. But in terms of the idea behind it and the approach and the tone, I don't think you can have much arguments. I think for it's kind of that energy, as you say, is something that I feel is maybe what fans haven't necessarily seen from him, but that they saw from his predecessor quite a lot, that they felt they could relate with. And it shows he cares, which he does, and I know he does. But yeah, I mean, in terms of messaging, again, similarly to Anthony Richens, really, it's very difficult in his situation to say the right thing, because I think in many ways fans don't really want to hear what he has to say, and I mean that in the nicest way, because they just want to see results, they just want to see performances, they just want to see their team functioning in a certain way and in a better way than what they've been doing. So anything you say in that situation is not going to be the message or the quote or the kind of idea that maybe supporters want to cling on to. That only comes really when you have credit in the bank, and then you can be a bit more dicey with what you say. So I think all in all, you look at that, and I found his demeanor today really interesting. For again, I think there's probably pros and cons for and against it, but also I don't want to say out of character, but maybe a kind of new side to him that maybe we haven't seen since he joined Norwich City. And in some aspects that's refreshing, and in other aspects I think people will probably say that it's not.
Wonderful. That's really interesting to hear. In terms of how he handles himself, and that comment at the end there about maybe sort of breaking the mold, getting out of the pattern that he was in. That's really interesting to hear from my perspective, especially because, as I said, we don't see him every day. We don't go to these press conferences as fans. We don't get to read his character beyond 90 minutes on a Saturday afternoon, where it looks like he's just stood there with his hands in his pockets. But we know that's not the case. That's just a very easy and very cheap comment to make. Let's talk about, and I'm kind of weighing up in my head which one we should go with first. I think we should go for playing style. I think I'm going to give you my thoughts, and then I'm going to stop talking. And I'm going to let you talk, because I don't really know how to put this into a question. But where I'm at is, when I look at Norwich at the moment, and we spoke about this a lot during pre-season, just sort of amongst ourselves, I remember, but the Dean Smith style seemed like high press, be a little bit better defensively, whatever that looks like. That's just such a typical thing to say. And then in terms of on the ball, we were seeing in the season, at the beginning of the season, those sort of spells, fairly inconsistent, fairly patchy, but of what has been described as Farkball, some really nice passages of play, some really good just passing and sort of retaining of possession. But again, it was patchy, it was inconsistent, and it seems at the moment that none of that is in effect, and performances seem to be getting, I don't want to say worse, but like worse, but also the same, in the sense of things are getting worse, but actual performances on the pitch are just kind of going along like that. It's not catastrophic. It's not like, oh my God, we're going to get relegated. That's not the case at all. It's just that you look at the factors of, one, Norwich need to get promoted. Two, Norwich have said they want to get promoted. Three, we've almost been promised we'll get promoted, essentially. But that doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. The style of play, Connor, please give me some sort of hope, or pile on some more misery.
Well, I mean, so what I'm in alignment with you really. What I was kind of expecting Norwich City to be this summer after a pre-season where Dean Smith, Craig Shakespeare, Liam Bramley had pretty much the entirety of the summer. Well, they did have the entirety of the summer, in fact, to embed their philosophy and their value and what they wanted their team to play. They speak about these 4 principles so much, and I kind of asked him about it today and whether he'd seen that and in his team, and he said that he had. Um, didn't really say how consistently, but again, kind of said really it's usually kind of the players knowing what feels good and them showing the players what's good in terms of video, and rather than perhaps on the grass. So what I expected Norwich City to be was a bit like you, quite energetic, quite dynamic, quite high pressing, but I'd probably be willing to rephrase that as intelligent pressing. I think this idea that if you press, it has to be high and super light, to quote Jurgen Klopp, rock and roll all the time. It doesn't have to be. You can be a pressing team and not high press. So I probably expected Norwich to be intelligent and probably varied with their pressing. And I also probably expected them to have less of the ball, but still mostly to be orientated around having the ball and being a side that likes to control games with the ball. And actually, that word control is a really interesting one because I feel it's been used a lot when actually what's actually meant is we've had a lot of the ball rather than we've had a lot of control. I think you tend to find that Norwich have had quite a bit of the ball, but opposition teams have probably controlled the areas on the pitch that they've allowed them to have it. And so for me, looking at it, and again, this is subjective, but that's not control. If I was coaching a team, I wouldn't define that as control. Other coaches obviously are completely different, but I was probably expecting those facets that I've just listed to be Norwich City, to be what they were, to be recognisable. And in many ways, that was quite an exciting proposition because you had this kind of evolution away from what Norwich City were, where yes, they were good to watch, but they conceded a lot of goals, and it was proven over 2 seasons that it wasn't durable to the Premier League at this kind of club and at what they were trying to do and the level of resource that they possessed. So there had to be an element of evolution, and this probably feeds back into the Stuart Weber point, really, and the whole why has he changed his outlook on football? Because what Norwich are doing now is different, but equally it doesn't contain many of the facets that I thought it would. Norwich, so Tuesday night was a really good example. Norwich set up to press in a certain way. The structure was all wrong. So they were set up wrong. It's as simple as that because they went into the game with a game plan and that game plan was wrong and they had to tweak it and essentially flatten off their midfield and really become quite narrow and sit quite deep in a way that you would expect teams to do when they come to Carrow Road and invite Burnley around the sides and say, go on, then get across in the box and score a header. And that probably culminated in the making the game quite boring. So from a game plan perspective, it worked. But from an aesthetic sort of perspective and from an expectation perspective, because as I said, Norwich City fans are used to winning at this level, but they're used to winning in a certain way. And when winning becomes the norm, you focus on the processes, as I say. And if the processes aren't where they need to be, then you're left with kind of what we've seen this season, really, which is inconsistency, not a team that's not particularly great to watch. I watched Norwich City on Tuesday night. Didn't really enjoy what they were doing. I enjoyed what Burnley was doing, and that's honestly the truth. I don't think we've seen a consistent level of performance over 90 minutes. I'll rephrase that. I don't think we've seen a consistent high level of performance over 90 minutes. I think we've seen spells within games where they've looked pretty good at times, but often those have come in losing positions or periods where I feel it's quite easy to play in as a player. So, for example, when they're 2-0 down at Watford, I think it's quite easy then to try and be courageous and to try and force the issue. It's a lot harder at 0-0 when the game's tighter. And I see a team that, and again, there's mitigation for this because there's been injuries and he's had no left backs and no defensive midfielder. But I'm not seeing a consistency in the team in terms of what they're trying to do in terms of approach. And, for all the talk of mitigation and injuries, actually the defensive aspect of their play on Tuesday night, I felt was fairly capable. It was competent. It was the attacking areas that were the issue. And a lot of those players were players that you would place in that team if you were picking from a full squad of players. So for me, I don't feel that the attacking elements are particularly great. And I don't think in the final third, they're particularly great. They lack imagination. They lack creativity. That's a structural issue as well as an individual issue. And I think they're a lot more interchangeable in terms of stylistically than I was expecting. I don't think they have a clear and coherent style from the beginning of games. I think they probably adapt to whatever is placed in front of them, and at a level where you have the quality of player that you have, in my opinion and my belief of how football works, you should be looking to impose yourself on that way a lot more, which is why I go back to this argument about why Norwich City probably need an ideologist at this level and a pragmatist and a problem solver at Premier League level, where it is about these qualities that Dean Smith is displaying in terms of nullifying opponents, trying to be good at certain elements of the game, in a defensive block, in transition. And I feel actually when you're a team that is expected to dominate games, you can't really do some of the stuff that Dean Smith is asking this Norwich City team to do. And so it all becomes a bit muddled and a bit stodgy and a bit clumsy. And that's where I feel Norwich City are at the moment. And it's very difficult to fix that in a period where you're not really training very much as well. So add all of that in, and I think you kind of get where Norwich City are at the moment, which is a little bit unsure of themselves. I've seen sides that I feel are better coached. And that's, again, sounds like a criticism of Dean Smith, but I think it's probably more a credit of the other coaches. Where I am critical of Smith is I don't believe that it takes 11 months to build a style. You look at the top of the championship at the moment, you've got Vincent Kompany at the top. He's had 16 games. You look at who's second, I think it's QPR and Mick Beale. He's had 16 games. Blackburn in third, John Dal Tomasin. He's had 16, 17 games at the start of this season. All of them play with a clear, coherent style of play that they impose on the opposition. And I feel that, and again, when I talk about eras and cycles and trends in football, you have to have an idea of what you're going to do and execute it. And I just feel that Norwich City are too responsive at the moment. And that's my opinion.
My next question, I think it really does link to everything you've just said, is what do you make of the idea that Norwich are in a position now where it very much feels like the 2016-2017 season under Alex Neil, where the beginning of that season, flying quite high, winning games, by the end of it, all hell broke loose. Do you see similarities? Do you see differences? Do you see that as a claim that is maybe a little bit extreme, given the position the club was in at the time compared to where it is now? Or do you sort of see it as 50-50? I'm kind of in the camp of 50-50. One, I think, yeah, that is a pretty good sort of something to compare it to in terms of the situations, the idea that results don't necessarily lead to a sustainable future, but also at the same time, the club was off the back end of, or coming towards the back end of, the Moxie era and real toxicity within the football club, and 3 seasons in, or sorry, 4 of 5 seasons in the Premier League, whereas this time round it's a bit more different. What do you make of the idea that you can really sort of compare the two?
Yeah, I see parallels. I remember, because obviously I was a fan at that time rather than in my role now, so I probably didn't look at it in the same way. So it's difficult to say, well, here's a season I covered and there's a season I cover, and when you do that, it's probably easier to pull out links between the two. So I'm sure if you were having this conversation with Pad, for example, it would probably be slightly different. And I know it would be, because I've spoken to him before. But I remember when I was watching it as a fan, there was always this feeling around the start of that season when Norwich City were winning games that they weren't playing particularly well. And again, I go back to, and this is just my belief in how football works. So you'll have different ideas of how it works. Someone else, or Dean Smith will, someone else will. But I believe in order to get consistent results, you have to have consistent performances. And so that's why when Norwich City were winning games, it was often quite difficult for me, because I'd be setting up my camera post-match to do my video verdicts, and I felt like I was being really negative. Like Norwich had just won 3-0 against Coventry, and I've come out and said, I don't think they've played very well. I'm not sure this bodes well for the future. But they'd won 3-0, and then they'd win the next game. And you almost have to wonder, do I need to align what I think about football here? And I didn't really do that. And I tried to kind of express maybe my position and why I was concerned. And it's obviously transpired in the way that I feared that it might. And my hope was that actually, if Norwich could keep getting results, that performance levels would be dragged up by the confidence created by those results. And again, it's almost a parallel that we saw with that season under Alex Neil that we spoke about. It was such a brittle, fragile group in terms of mentality. And again, a lot of that is because of the experience that he's had over the last 12, 18 months. That as soon as there's a bit of adversity, I think kind of the battle scars get reopened again and they become gaping wounds pretty quickly. And the muscle memory of what has gone before is easy to come out again. But obviously you're doing it in a different climate this time because you're not playing Tottenham. You're playing Luton, not to be disrespectful to these teams, you're playing Luton where the onus is on you to try and force something to happen. And that's a lot harder to be in that position with no confidence, to be in a position where you've got to defend for 90 minutes with no confidence. Both are not ideal, but when you're trying to be the protagonist, it's a lot harder, I think, to do that without having a degree of confidence and a degree of belief in what you're doing. And that's, again, not to say that Norwich don't have any belief in what they're doing. I think it's probably quite the contrary. So, yeah, naturally, I think there are parallels. I think there are some exaggerations. No two seasons are the same, but that feeling of kind of something's wrong, something's disjointed, something needs a refresh, I think that's very similar. Again, so I think there's probably similar feelings rather than parallels in terms of what they're trying to do stylistically and the profile of the squad and stuff. But, yeah, I mean, as we sit here now with Norwich embarking on the run that they are embarking on, it's very difficult to construct an argument that this season isn't trailing in the same direction as that one. And Norwich had a pretty decent home record that year. It was more on the road where they struggled. But it just feels like, and I've used this expression a lot, that there's a downwards momentum around the whole club. And I think we kind of touched upon it at the start. And I'm not really sure how Norwich City get themselves out of that because it's already been shown that just winning without a performance, without anything attached to it, isn't going to do that. You need something else. So what is that something else?
Yeah, it's a very tough question. It's one that we don't have a definitive answer to, which, you know, you look at football in general and there is an abyss that we look into, isn't there? Which is, well, there's no definitive answer to anything. I guess you can apply that to life, but we're talking about football and we speculate. And that's all we can do, which is, in my head, that's why we're not going to talk about the game tomorrow, because I don't think there's any point, because previewing that game, all we would do is bring up the points we've already mentioned. So there's no use in that exercise. The last thing I want to ask you, and to be honest, I'm not going to talk about this myself because I have already, essentially. But I want to ask you this question, then we'll say sort of goodbye and we'll talk again at some point. Fingers crossed it's because we've been proven wrong. How likely that is, I don't know. But my question to you is, who's improved as a footballer under Dean Smith? Because that's a big part of you know, this culture that Norwich City have created, this idea that it's not just about results. It's not just about performance and providing entertaining football. It's about developing footballers. Anthony Richards said it in the interview himself. That's a massive, or it's the biggest part of Norwich's income, especially in terms of the transfer budget. Player trading. Well, how do you trade players? You grow them, you improve them, you sell them. For 4 years, Norwich City were doing it very, very well. Dean Smith's been in charge for nearly a year now, and where circumstances were different in the sense of, we talk about style of football and we talk about the squad as a whole. In the Premier League, you can almost forgive what happened. But when it comes to players improving in that 11 months, I don't think you can be quite as loose. You can't be quite as forgiving. Who's improved for Norwich City, other than maybe Josh Sargent, of which I'll let you talk.
Well, I mean, it depends what you want to measure it against. If you want to measure it against last season, the vast majority of them improved, because it would have been harder to be much worse this year. I know that probably doesn't mean a lot to people, but I think that's very difficult to argue against. But I get the premise of the question in terms of individually who is a better player now than they were 12 months ago. And it's a very difficult one to answer, to be honest. And that is on the head coach and the systems and the structure and the coaching of the team who are currently in place. And again, a lot of that for me is, why did Max Aarons look so good? Why did Teemu Pukki look so good? Why did Emi Buendia look so good? Why did Ollie Skip look so good? It's because they had a system that allowed them to flourish and their individual talents to flourish. And when you have a clear, coherent structure, look, for me, I'll strip it back. I think football's really simple, really, really simple. And I think it gets overcomplicated. All football clubs need to do, and I say this all, it's quite a big thing. You need to settle on a style of play, appoint a coach to implement a style of play, recruit players to carry out that style of play, and time. And when you have all of that, I think you kind of get what Norwich City were under Daniel Farke, where they grow over a period of time, players grow over a period of time, and players can look pretty good because they're in a system that ultimately they were recruited to play in, and so they look good in that. And actually, what Dean Smith has been left with, and this is where I do have sympathy with him, and why I don't think the who's improved argument is solely on his door. Obviously, there's a chunk of it that is, as with anything, but he's been kind of left with a mismatch of players. Some were recruited for Daniel Farke's style of play. Some were recruited for Premier League seasons and proved they weren't good enough and proved that they didn't really fit in terms of what they were trying to do. And he's been kind of left with both of those. And all he's really added is Isaac Hayden, who's a player he really, really wanted, Aaron Ramsey, Nunez and Sarah. He's only added 4 players to this group. So it's very difficult to say this is a Dean Smith group of players. But in the same token, he is a good enough coach. His CV suggests he is a good enough coach to get these players into a system to allow them to flourish. So that's why there is a degree of responsibility on his door. So yeah, I'm not really sure is the answer. And maybe that's the most damning indictment on his spell as Norwich City head coach. Yeah, I don't know. And even Sargent, I think there's an argument to probably say that improvement hasn't necessarily come in his natural position. So it's probably not even really, I don't want to say helpful. Of course it's helpful, but it's maybe not where he would want it to be anyway. And maybe because he's been played out of position, it's not quite what it would be anyway, as if he was playing his natural position. So there are caveats to everything, but that's my answer. I think I've sat on the fence there a bit, but hopefully I've delved into the reasons as to why the answer maybe is the answer that it is.
Yeah, I think I said at the very beginning of this, I'm a fan. I can say what I want, well, within reason. And I don't have any sort of anything to worry. I don't have sort of journalist credibility to worry about. But from what you've said there,
it depends who you speak to. I don't think I have much, to be honest. So.
It's a very good point. But from what you've said there, to me, it speaks absolute volumes. I think that's as close to you saying, well, no one as we're going to get, because you've not named a single player. You could have just named a player and maybe lied and maybe exaggerated the truth just to create.
I mean, I always try and say what I see. I don't think there is a player that has improved in the last 12 months, and that's the actuality of it. I think what I've tried to do is hopefully explain some of the caveats around that, and also why that is the case that it is. And look, some of it's circumstance. A high chunk of that time was played in the Premier League in a team that wasn't very good and had no belief. So no one's going to look very good in a team that's losing every week. So it's a difficult one to answer. And everyone looks really great in the team that's winning every week. So again, there's a degree of circumstance around that. But yeah, I mean, strip the question of all context, and the answer is probably, well, it's difficult to pick out a single name, isn't it? As we've struggled to do so. I'm sure there are some if you sat down and really considered it and looked at the raw data of it. But obviously, we don't have that time in this particular instance. So you're going purely off eye test, and I don't believe that enough players have improved substantially enough for us to mention them, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be like a stat merchant out there who will he'll whip out some stats at some point. But I'm a strong believer of if you have to get like a lot of the stats you see these days, if you have to get those out to disprove someone, then you're not enjoying football for football. But that is a political football point that I'll keep to myself for now. Connor, a pleasure as always. I'm prayed to God. I am praying as we speak to the big man upstairs that the next time we speak, Norwich are in a much better position. Who will be in charge of Norwich in whatever sort of position in the hierarchy at the club? I don't know who that will be. I said we were going to talk about Russell Martin. That's a whole other video in itself, just because that one's quite funny to me. But I pray for better times. It's not the worst. It's not the end of the world. We aren't going to lose our football club. It's not like when the sort of Man United fans had the barbed wire over the pictures of Old Trafford and all that nonsense. We're not thinking we're going to lose our football club, but we can only talk about what we see and how we feel. Any sort of things or anything you want to plug? Any articles coming up? Any that you've written? Maybe that one about Stuart Weber. I think it is worth mentioning as well.
Yeah, just the Pinkin generally. You know where to find. Oh, excuse me. You know where to find us now. As I lose my voice at the end of this. Go and subscribe to the Pinkin Plus app if you haven't already. Daily content on there. Plenty of stuff that you can have a look at. There's a free trial as well, so take that out for a month and kind of make your own mind up. But we try and offer as extensive a coverage as we can of Norwich City in whatever predicament it is in, and we try our best. So yeah, give that a look. That's probably the only plug I have, I think, Ben.
Top banana. Right. Thank you all very much for watching. If you want to leave your thoughts in the comments, that would be appreciated. Anything me and Connor have spoken about, if you want to like the video, please feel free to subscribe to if you fancy it. We're well on our way to 2K subscribers. We're very, very slowly getting there. But as I said, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all again very, very soon.